The nurse handed me a folded billing slip and said it mattered more than my test results. I'd been coming to Cardiac Care Associates on Broadmoor Avenue for 14 months. Every 3 weeks, same waiting room, same fish tank, same wall clock that ran 4 minutes fast. I knew which chair didn't wobble. I knew that Tuesdays were slower. I knew my ejection fraction by heart, 32%, and I knew what that number meant for a 63-year-old man who'd spent 35 years breathing recycled air inside a steel mill. What I didn't know was that $2,400 was about to become the difference between my heart continuing to beat and gambling that it wouldn't stop on its own. The billing notice said my Medicare Part B and my supplemental insurance had covered everything they were going to cover. The balance on my ICD upgrade procedure, scheduled for the end of the month, fell to me. $2,400. The nurse, a quiet woman who'd been doing this job for 20 years and had the kind of patient eyes that come from watching too many people receive bad news, said the billing office needed payment confirmed before they'd release the OR slot. I said I'd handle it. She nodded the way medical people nod when they aren't sure you can. In my truck in the parking lot, I looked at my phone. I had $107 in checking and $340 in savings. My pension from 35 years at Allegheny Steel covered rent, utilities, and groceries, but just barely. I scrolled to my son's name. I hadn't called him in 5 months. Before that, maybe twice in the previous year. He was in Chicago now. He had his own financial advisory firm, Brennan Capital Management. 2 months ago, I'd caught him on CNBC, sitting across from a weekend anchor talking about market volatility and managed portfolios. He looked polished. His suit probably cost more than I made in a week at the mill. I pressed call. He answered on the 4th ring. I could hear the ambient noise of a busy office behind him, voices, movement, the particular energy of a place where people are always moving money around. "Hey, Dad." His voice was bright, distracted. "Hold on 1 second. I waited. A door closed. "Sorry." He came back on the line. "Big day over here. You catch the news?" I hadn't. "What news?" "We just closed a $9 million portfolio restructuring for a group of institutional clients. Biggest deal the firm's ever done." His voice had the lift of genuine pride, and for a moment I remembered the morning I'd driven him to his first real job interview. The way his hands had shaken, how I'd told him to breathe, how I'd meant every word when I said I believed in him. "That's something," I said. "Congratulations." Yeah, it really is. "So what's up?" I told him. 14 months of heart failure, the ICD upgrade, the gap in coverage, $2,400 by the end of the month. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man caught off guard. It was the silence of a man calculating something. "Dad," he said finally. The brightness was gone. "This really isn't great timing." "I'm not trying to time it well," I said. "I'm trying to stay alive." "I hear you. But the firm just committed to major reinvestment after this deal. My own funds are pretty tied up right now, and Veronica and I just put a deposit on a winter rental in Scottsdale. Things are stretched." He suggested I look into a payment plan. He said it the way he probably said things to clients, gently, helpfully, in a tone that expected gratitude for the advice. I thanked him for his time. He said he'd call later in the week. He didn't. I sat in that parking lot for a long time, October in Pittsburgh, the sky the color of old newsprint, the trees going bare. 35 years I'd walked into that mill at 5 in the morning, rain or snow or dead July heat. I was foreman the last 12 years. I raised 2 kids on that income, kept the lights on, kept shoes on their feet, sent my son to Penn State without a dollar of student loans because I'd worked 4 years of overtime to cover his tuition. I missed his freshman orientation because I was covering a shift for a guy whose wife had just had twins. I thought I was building something. I drove home through streets I'd lived on for 30 years. Small house in Munhall, 2 bedrooms. The yard I'd redone myself the summer before my wife got sick. I hung my jacket and stood in the kitchen, not quite ready to do anything. On the counter was a framed photo. My son at his graduation. Cap and gown, big smile. I was standing next to him in a sport coat I'd bought at Sears 3 weeks before. We were both squinting in the sun. I looked at it the way you look at old photographs when you're trying to find where the story changed. My phone rang. My daughter. She'd already heard. She didn't ask if I was okay because she knew I'd say yes. She asked how much. I told her. I told her not to come over. She came over. She showed up 40 minutes later in her scrubs from her shift at Hillside Gardens nursing home. She worked there as a home health aide. 8-hour days minimum, sometimes 12 when someone called off. $14.50 an hour. She had 2 kids at home, Emma, who was 8, and Liam, who was 6, and their father had been out of the picture for 2 years. She drove a 2014 Honda with 140,000 miles on it. She walked in without being invited and sat at my kitchen table and put down an envelope. I told her I wasn't taking her money. She told me to open it. Inside was cash, 5s, 10s, 20s, a few 50s, the kind of money that accumulates slowly, shift by shift, week by week. I counted it twice, $940. That's my emergency fund, she said, every dollar I'd saved since January. I tried to give it back. She wouldn't let go of my hand. You worked in that mill for 35 years, she said. You never asked anyone for anything. Her voice had the particular stubbornness I recognized because she'd gotten it directly from me. Let me do this, please. I was still short, but for the first time that day, I didn't feel alone. Hello, and welcome. Before we go any further, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit like and subscribe. It means more than I can say. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And one quick note, this story is rooted in real experience, but contains fictionalized elements for storytelling purposes. The emotions are true. Some details have been changed, but the lesson, that one is as real as anything I've ever known. My old shift partner, Floyd Kimura, showed up in the parking lot outside my house 2 nights later. Floyd had been beside me for 19 years at the mill. He was 61 now, retired. Drove a truck for his brother-in-law's plumbing company part-time just to stay busy. He'd heard through the Brotherhood, that informal network of retired Allegheny steel men who'd spent decades working side by side in the same heat and danger. When one of us was in trouble, word moved fast. He knocked on my truck window. Hadn't called first, just showed up. Murphy said, "You're short on a medical bill," he said. "Don't tell me it's not true." I didn't deny it. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. The guys put something together. I started to refuse. He stopped me before I could get the words out. He said that when men work beside each other for 30 years, in a place where the equipment can kill you on a Tuesday without warning, what they build between them is thicker than charity. He said the word for it was brotherhood, and that I'd spent my whole career earning it, and I didn't get to refuse it now. He held out the envelope. I took it. Inside was $960, 20s and 50s, paper clipped together. A note in cramped handwriting. "Get the procedure done. We need you at the Christmas party." I counted what I had. My own savings, my daughter's emergency fund, the Brotherhood's envelope, $3,007, more than enough. I called the billing office the next morning. Sat at my kitchen table afterward and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief, but underneath it, something colder and harder. Something that had settled in my chest like slag that doesn't cool the way it should. My son was renting a second home in Arizona. He'd closed a $9 million deal, and men who earned less in a year than his firm probably spent on client dinners had pooled their cash to keep me breathing. A letter arrived 4 days later. State letterhead, Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry, Workers' Compensation Division. In 2001, a steel coil strapping had failed and a section of beam had come down across my left shoulder and upper back. 4 months of physical therapy, 2 surgeries, a permanent partial restriction on overhead lifting. I'd filed a claim. The mill's insurance carrier denied it. I appealed. Same answer. I went back to work on naproxen and stubbornness, and I told myself I'd let it go. I'd let it go for 22 years. The letter said the state had conducted a retroactive audit of workers' comp claims from the late 90s through 2003 and identified a pattern of systematic denial in heavy manufacturing cases. My claim was among those reassessed. The check was paper-clipped to the second page. $24,500. I sat down hard at the kitchen table. The refrigerator hummed. A neighbor's dog barked at something in the alley. 22 years late. For an injury I'd been carrying in my shoulder every winter since 2001. That particular ache that comes back when the temperature drops, that I'd stopped mentioning to anyone, because what's the point of mentioning what doesn't change? I thought about Floyd's envelope, about my daughter's $940, her entire emergency fund, saved dollar by dollar on $14.50 an hour with 2 kids to feed, about the fact that my son still hadn't called back. I knew an attorney named Alec Sherwood. He'd handled my wife's estate when she passed 3 years ago. Sharp, quiet, thorough. Former corporate attorney gone private practice, specializing in financial disputes and civil litigation. We'd had coffee twice since then. The way you maintain certain relationships without quite being friends. I called him. We met at a diner on Route 51 the next afternoon. I laid out everything, the medical bills, my son's refusal, the settlement check, and something else, the nagging fact that for 2 years, every time I'd tried to apply for a medical credit line or healthcare financing account, I'd been denied. My credit score had dropped from the high 700s, where it had sat for 30 years, down to 590. I'd assumed it was age or income. I'd stopped trying to understand it. Alec asked if he could look into my son's financial activity and my own credit history at the same time. I told him I might not want to know what he found. He said that was exactly why I needed to let him look. He called me 11 days later and asked me to come to his office. The folder on his desk was thicker than I expected. Alec had the particular stillness of someone who's delivered difficult news before and has learned to let the silence do some of the work first. Your son opened a home equity line of credit against your property in March of 2020, he said. $50,000. Your signature is on the application. I never signed any application. He slid the document across the desk. I looked at the signature on line 17. It looked like my handwriting. It wasn't. He placed a second sheet beside it, a handwriting analysis. The conclusion was in the final paragraph. The signature on the HELOC application was inconsistent with the subject's authentic signature samples across multiple reference documents. Probability of forgery. High. $50,000. Secured against my house. My son had borrowed against my home, without my knowledge, using my forged name, and had defaulted on the payments 18 months later. The account had gone to collections. That was why my credit score had collapsed. That was why I couldn't get a medical credit line when I needed one most. My hands didn't shake. 35 years working around equipment that can kill you. If you flinch, teaches you to be very still when everything else wants to move. There's more, Alec said. He pulled out a third document, a complaint filed with FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, against Brennan Capital Management, filed by a man named Reginald Holloway and his wife, Phyllis, ages 74 and 71, retired school teachers from Naperville, Illinois. According to the complaint, a financial advisor at Brennan Capital, my son specifically, the complaint named him, had persuaded the Holloways to liquidate a conservative annuity they'd held for 18 years and reinvest the proceeds into a high-fee managed fund. The advisor had represented the projected returns as reliable and safe. They were not. The Holloways had lost $68,000 of their retirement savings. When they tried to escalate the complaint, they were told that the risk disclosures they'd signed protected the firm from liability. Reginald and Phyllis Holloway were retired school teachers living on Social Security, and whatever remained. I asked Alec what our options were. He told me the HELOC forgery was a felony. He told me the FINRA complaint created a parallel civil track. He told me that with the right approach, both could proceed simultaneously. He asked if I was sure I wanted to proceed. I thought about my daughter at my kitchen door in her nursing home scrubs, holding an envelope with everything she'd saved. I thought about Floyd standing in an October parking lot, telling me brotherhood isn't charity. I told Alec to find the Holloways. If you're still with me right now, type the word mill in the comments. It lets me know you're here, and there's more I need to tell you. The Union Hall on Whitaker Avenue had been hosting retired steel workers' monthly gatherings since 1987. The building smelled like old coffee and industrial cleaner, and the particular permanence of a place where working people had been meeting for decades. Folding chairs, long tables, an American flag in the corner. I told Floyd I needed it for a Thursday evening. He didn't ask why. He said he'd get the word out. 41 men came. Some I'd worked beside for 20 years. Some I barely knew, friends of friends who'd heard what my son had done and showed up anyway. Alec was there. My daughter was there. Emma and Liam sitting beside her in the second row. Reginald Holloway had driven 4 hours from Naperville because Alec called him and explained what was happening, and he said he'd been waiting 2 years for someone to care enough to make the call. My son walked in at 7:03. He'd driven from Chicago. I'd told him I needed to talk in person, that it concerned his inheritance, that it couldn't wait. He arrived in a coat that probably cost $800. He looked around the room, and the calculation on his face was immediate. He was trying to understand the geometry of what he'd walked into. He looked at me. "Dad, what is this?" "Sit down," I said. He sat. I didn't start with the documents. I started at the beginning. I told the room what my life had been. 35 years inside Allegheny Steel, the shift work, the injuries, the 4 years of overtime I'd worked to send my son to Penn State debt-free, the way I'd sat in a cardiologist's office and been told I owed $2,400 and called my son and been told he was stretched thin because of a winter rental in Scottsdale. My son opened his mouth. Floyd, sitting 3 chairs to my left, looked at him once. He closed his mouth. My daughter stood. She was not a person who liked public speaking. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and she was looking at her brother, not at the room. "I gave Dad my emergency fund," she said. $940. Money I'd saved over 10 months for a car repair fund, for a missed shift, for one of the kids getting sick. She paused. "I gave it to him because he needed it to live, and because you wouldn't." My son's jaw tightened. "You don't know the full picture." "I know what I know," she said, and she sat back down. Reginald Holloway stood slowly. He was a large man, white-haired, with the patient voice of someone who'd spent 30 years explaining things to children who didn't want to listen. "My name is Reginald Holloway," he said. "I taught middle school science in Naperville for 31 years. My wife and I saved carefully for our entire adult lives." He looked at my son. "3 years ago, your advisor convinced us to move our retirement annuity into a managed fund. He said the risk was minimal. He said the returns were reliable. He didn't mention that the fund charged 3 times the management fee, or that the disclaimers we signed on page 32 of the prospectus made everything he'd told us verbally unenforceable. We lost $68,000. My wife and I are now living on Social Security, and what's left." The room was completely still. My son said the disclosures were standard. "I know," Alex said. He'd risen from his chair. "That doesn't change what you told them before they signed." He laid the documents on the table in 3 neat stacks: the HELOC application, the handwriting analysis, the FINRA complaint, the default records, the collections account that had destroyed my credit score for 2 years while I tried to finance medical care and couldn't understand why. My son stared at his own name on the documents. I watched his face as each piece landed. "I intended to pay it back before you ever needed to know," he said finally. A murmur moved through the room. Floyd said, quiet enough that only the men near him could hear, "There it is." I walked to the front of the room. I stood where I could see my son clearly. "You have 2 choices," I said. He looked at me, the way men look when they're trying to assess how much trouble they're actually in. "First choice. You repay the $50,000 HELOC principal plus 5 years of standard interest. You fund a restitution account for the Holloways. Alec and I have agreed on $68,000, which is what they lost. You cooperate fully with the FINRA investigation, and you step away from independent financial advising for 5 years, voluntarily or otherwise." He said, "And if I don't?" "Alec files the Pennsylvania criminal complaint tomorrow morning. Everything in those folders enters the FINRA formal record. Your name, your firm's name, every document, on public record, permanently." He was quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone coughed near the back. "Dad," he said. The polish was gone entirely. He sounded like he was 22 again, standing in my kitchen after he'd totaled my truck and didn't know how to tell me. "I was going to fix it. I was going to make it right before it got here." "That's what people say when they get caught," Floyd said. "Not before." My son looked at Floyd. He looked at Reginald Holloway. He looked at my daughter, and at Emma and Liam sitting in the second row. Emma was watching him with the frank assessment of an 8-year-old who doesn't yet know she's supposed to pretend she doesn't understand what's happening. He looked at me last. "I'll take the first option," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Tell me what to sign." I nodded. Alec would handle the paperwork. The meeting was over. My son stood, moved toward the door, stopped. He turned back. "Dad, I know," I said. "I know you're sorry. I know things got complicated and the plans fell apart." He waited. But none of that changed what happened to the Holloways. And none of it changed the fact that when I needed $2,400 to survive, you told me about your winter rental and hung up. His eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it. "Men like Floyd," I said, "they don't have $9 million deals. They have mill shifts and whatever they manage to set aside. When I was in trouble, they showed up, without being asked, without conditions." I looked at him directly. "You didn't." He walked out into the November cold. Behind me, Floyd put one hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything. That's the thing about men you've worked beside in dangerous places. They know when silence is the right language. The paperwork took 6 weeks. The restitution agreement for the Holloways was finalized on a Tuesday morning in Alec's office. Documents were signed, handshakes were exchanged and mostly accepted. My son called my daughter in January and apologized to her directly without qualifications. She told me about it later, at her kitchen table while Emma showed me a drawing from school. She said she'd listened to the whole apology, and then told her brother that she'd be watching his actions, not his words, and that he had a long way to go before she'd know what kind of man he was becoming. She thought he understood. He called me in February. We talked for 40 minutes. It wasn't an easy conversation. Most honest ones between fathers and sons aren't. He told me things I hadn't known, about the pressure of running his own firm, about the year the market had turned against him, about a series of decisions that each seemed survivable in isolation and somehow accumulated into something he couldn't find his way back out of. I didn't tell him it was all right. It wasn't all right. But I listened, and I think that mattered. My ICD was upgraded and functioning by spring. My ejection fraction improved to 41%. My cardiologist said I was doing well for where I'd started. I told him I had good people around me. The Holloways used their restitution to restore the annuity. Reginald sent a Christmas card with a note at the bottom. He wrote, "Thank you for making the call. Most people don't bother." Phyllis added a line in her handwriting underneath. "We didn't think anyone was going to care. You proved us wrong." I keep that card on my refrigerator. My daughter was promoted to lead aide at Hillside Gardens in March. Better pay, better hours. Emma joined a soccer league. Liam lost 2 teeth in the same week and was certain that was the greatest thing that had ever happened to anyone. Floyd and I have coffee on Wednesday mornings at a place on 8th Avenue that's been there since the 70s. We talk about the Steelers and the mill and the particular grace of having survived long enough to sit in a diner with nowhere urgent to be. I think about a morning I met my son alone before the paperwork was done. Just the two of us in a parking lot. February cold, his hands in his pockets. He said I forgot what it meant to have someone who would show up for me no matter what, and instead of protecting it, I spent it. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. But I thought about Floyd in an October parking lot with an envelope. I thought about my daughter at my door in her scrubs with $940 and that stubbornness she'd inherited honestly. I thought about 41 men in folding chairs who came on a Thursday night because one of their own needed them to. The workers' comp claim from 2001 sat buried in a state file for 22 years. The truth about my son sat buried even longer, under excuses and careful distances, and the particular silences that grow between people who've stopped telling each other hard things. Both of them surfaced when the time came. My son was right that he'd spent something that took a lifetime to build. Whether a man can earn back what he's wasted, one honest day at a time, that's a question only time answers. I don't know the ending yet. But I'm still here. My heart is still beating. And on Wednesday mornings over bad coffee, Floyd tells me that's enough to start with, and I'm starting to believe he's right.